In November 1956, 82 men packed into an old boat designed for 20 and sailed from Mexico toward Cuba. After 7 days battling seasickness and leaks in dark, swampy waters, they finally made landfall. They arrived carrying rifles and anti-tank guns, determined to begin a war against their government. The leader of the group was Fidel Castro. He had already attempted to overthrow the Cuban government once before, and this time he was returning with a small, dedicated army to finish the job. Among his men was an Argentine doctor, Ernesto Che Guevara. During his student years, Guevara traveled Latin America on a motorcycle, witnessing a level of poverty and suffering that turned his medical ambitions toward revolution. To these men, the Cuban government was a puppet of foreign interests. They saw villages where children went barefoot and unschooled, while the capital, Havana, functioned as a playground for American companies and wealthy tourists in luxury casinos. While it is easy to see how a boss exploits an individual worker, Guevara and Castro believed the problem was systemic. They argued that entire wealthy nations, specifically the United States, were designed to extract wealth from poorer ones. If they were right, it meant the global economy wasn't just competitive, it was structurally rigged. History offered plenty of evidence for their anger. By the early 20th century, the United Fruit Company had built a commercial empire across Latin America, controlling vast plantations and mines. Locals called the company the octopus because its tentacles reached into every level of society. It built railways, towns, and even maintained a police force. This wasn't trade, it was looting. Standard economics taught that trade helped poor countries get richer, but Andre Gunder Frank thought the opposite. A German-born economist who lived across Latin America, Frank rejected the free market lessons of his teachers, studying the exploitation he saw. Frank's dependency theory divided the world into 2 spheres. At the center is a core of wealthy countries in Europe and North America. On the edge, the periphery, are the poor nations of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. In this model, the core wins specifically because the periphery loses. The profits from exports like coffee and bananas don't go toward local development. Instead, they are sucked out by foreign companies to fuel wealthy nations. Frank concluded that world capitalism leads to the development of underdevelopment. In his view, the system was unfixable, and as long as poor nations remained connected to it, the wealth gap would only continue to grow. While Frank pushed for revolution, Argentinian economist Raúl Prebisch found a mathematical reason for this wealth drain. As a high-ranking official in the United Nations, Prebisch's findings challenged the very foundation of global trade theory. Traditional economics says nations should focus on what they are best at. If Cuba is better at sugar than building cars, it should sell sugar and buy American cars. Theoretically, this specialization should raise the standard of living for everyone. Prebisch saw a trap in this math. As people get richer, their demand for food and coffee stays relatively flat. You only need so much sugar. But their demand for complex goods like cars and electronics grows rapidly. This creates a vicious cycle. The price of cars rises much faster than the price of sugar. To pay for the same number of imports, the poor country has to export more and more of its raw resources every year, perpetually lagging behind. For Castro and Guevara, the answer was to seize power and exit the system entirely. After winning their war in 1959, they took control of foreign companies and moved toward a socialist model, believing only absolute revolution could end exploitation. Prebisch proposed a different path: diversification. He argued that poor countries should stop specializing in raw materials. By closing borders to foreign imports and using export profits to build domestic factories, they could eventually produce their own cars and electronics. By the 1970s, the wealthy core began to strike back. A series of violent military coups unseated socialist governments across Latin America, often replacing them with regimes that favored free market capitalism. The United States frequently intervened to protect its commercial interests and limit the influence of its rival, the Soviet Union. This meddling included supporting coups and even direct invasions to ensure that independent nations remained within the capitalist orbit. In Chile, the military took control and brought in a group of Chicago-trained economists to dismantle the socialist experiment. While the Chicago Boys reinstated free markets, revolutionary figures like Che Guevara were hunted and executed. With the radical revolutions crushed or isolated, dependency theory fell out of fashion. But while the theorists fled into exile, a different group of nations was proving that the trap could, in fact, be escaped. The most successful challenge to the core didn't come from the hills of Cuba, but from the rising economies of East Asia. The Asian tigers, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, transformed from poor nations to industrial giants in just a few decades. They utilized Prebish's principle of diversification, but with a twist. Rather than just making goods for themselves, they aggressively built domestic industries, like shipping and electronics, specifically to sell to the rest of the world. Then moving from raw materials to high-value manufacturing, these nations used global trade as a lever for development rather than a drain. Today, China is attempting to repeat this transition on an even larger scale. The history of the 20th century confirms that the global economy is skewed to favor the wealthy, but it also shows that poor nations aren't doomed to be victims. The key to escaping the dependency trap isn't necessarily leaving the system, it's finding a way to climb higher within it.